Hello, everyone. My name is Jack Eggemean,
My name is Krystle Brown.
My name is Kristy Kocot.
My name is Vanessa Rivera.
And I'm George Little.
and today we're presenting on Chapter 11, which is Cultural Rhetorical Studies and Rhetorical Theory by Timothy Borchers and Heather Hunley. To start off our presentation, we are going to introduce the thesis in order to provide you with a broad understanding of what we're going to be discussing throughout this presentation. We will then move into a discussion regarding the key terms, summary, main arguments, main connections, and scholarly source used within this presentation. The thesis of this chapter is, although there are key elements and differences among the studies of rhetoric and culture, these areas of focus are closely related, and the study of rhetoric benefits from the understanding of cultural studies. The work of cultural studies can be used to inform rhetorical analyses, and writers and rhetoricians can employ both a cultural and rhetorical study in order to effectively make judgments about a text.
Throughout this chapter, we came across many key terms that enhance our understanding of a cultural rhetoric study. The first of these terms include articulation. Articulation is defined as the joining together of two ideas that do not necessarily have any kind of natural connection. This key term is a type of representation, and meaning is always the result of some type of articulation. The relationship between religion and politics can be used to help us understand this term. According to the founding fathers, church and state should be separated. Despite this, religion have been articulated with politics over the years and played a pretty big role within our political structure. This idea of articulation is important to keep in mind because once ideas have been articulated, it is very hard to separate them from one another in our minds. Following articulation is cultural studies. This term is defined as a discipline that is concerned with the production, circulation, and reception of meanings in industrialized societies. This is an important study as it is closely related to our study of rhetoric and can even work to aid our work in rhetoric studies. Next is interpretive communities, which is defined as audiences who decode a text in a similar manner. The idea that people can interpret text differently is largely expressed within this culture, but the key term functions to show that some groups may interpret ideas the same way. When they do, they can be referred as interpretive communities. The next term is representation, which is defined as the meaning for a symbol as created through interaction. It reveals that meaning is dependent on how something such as a person, an idea, or object is represented. It helps explain the idea that we might have a different meaning for the same thing because of the different perspectives we have on the issue. Following representation is signification. This term is defined as the study of the process of meaning. This term is important as it helps to strengthen the understanding that meaning is not something that is fixed. This term relates directly to the next term, which is signifying practices. This term is defined as the ways that both symbols attain meaning. Through this chapter, we are introduced to the many ways symbols gain their meaning. One of these ways is that our position in relation to image determines what the image means to us. What also plays a role is how we give symbols meaning, is the way we identify with the image or symbol. Overall, we give certain things meanings based on our particular cultural context. Lastly, subject positions is a key term that is defined as a way of reading a text from a particular perspective. In other words, Borchers and Hunley states that a text positions its readers to look at it in a particular way. The three different subject positions that one can take while interpreting a text include dominant or preferred, negotiated, and oppositional. Dominant and preferred subject positions are defined as a reading of the text that accepts the most obvious interpretation. It espouses the dominant ideology. Negotiated subject positions are defined as a reading of the text where audiences understand the dominant ideology but adapt it to fit their own experiences. And lastly, oppositional subject positions are defined as a reading that opposes the dominant ideological message presented in the text.
Now that we have discussed the main key terms included in Chapter 11, let's examine how these terms relate to a larger summary of the chapter's main points. The chapter centers around rhetorical theory and its coordination to cultural studies. Culture in this case refers to the complete way of life for groups of people. The differences between critical theory and cultural studies is discussed. Cultural studies scholars focus on political economy, content, and audiences, while critical theorists may more so emphasize the cultural product, modes of production, and audience effect. The text further dives into the concept of culture as representation, or the process of how we learn to organize ideas, people, or objects. Representation is telling in the analysis of class, ethnicity, and gender. We assign meaning to groups and cultures based on representation. The particular context of a text or a form of media, or even what is not included within a specific medium, can be telling of representation and culture. Meaning is seen as contested in culture, signifying that meaning cannot be fixed or set completely. The chapter utilizes examples of media, such as the television show Fixer Upper and Fresh Off the Boat. The show references exemplify the manner in which how certain groups of or messages are portrayed and how they influence the context of cultural studies. In the case of the show Fixer Upper, the author expresses how the program curated a brand image for itself, which projected ideological messages onto its audience. On the other hand, the program Fresh Off the Boat was referenced for its position as the only sitcom portrayal of an Asian family. The observation of these shows helps us understand how ethnicity, class, gender, and even ideologies relate to what is known as culture studies. Overall, the chapter functions to reveal how a combined approach of culture and rhetoric studies can make for an effective analysis of a text or a media form.
Now that you have an understanding of what this chapter entails, we are going to move into the chapter's arguments. Although there are many arguments made throughout this chapter, we have chosen 3 significant arguments and ideas to focus on. The first of these arguments is that cultural studies scholars expand on the focuses of critical theorists by examining representation and signification, and it is through these focuses that these scholars reveal how meaning arises and identity forms. So basically, the critical theorists have some focuses within their study, which include things like the modes of production, the cultural product, and its effects on an audience. What the cultural studies scholars decided to do was expand on these same areas by looking deeply into context, which includes the ideas of representation and signification. Stuart Hall, a very influential cultural theorist, believed that these 2 ideas were thought of as central to how we, members of society, create meaning. He believed that meaning can always be contested, as meaning depends on how individuals, objects, or ideas are represented. In other words, different meanings can arise depending on how the representation of an object, idea, or person is. So going even further, Hall suggested that meaning doesn't even exist until the idea has been represented. To explain this, Borchers and Henley provide us with an example of Jessica Lynch, who became a symbol for American courage and bravery after being captured in the Iraq War and rescued by American troops. Before this representation, Lynch was just an ordinary American. Her representation of a symbol of courage and bravery was non-existent before the event itself. Following representation is signification, which further reveals how meaning and identity arise. Through this, we learn that absence deepens and expands the meaning we create for something. For example, if we see a family image of a mother and her daughter, we might recognize that there is no father present in the picture. And by seeing the absence of the father, we create the meaning that the mother might be a single parent. Another factor of this process includes the idea that we project ourselves into an image in order to create meaning. So basically, our position in relation to the image determines the meaning we give to it. Ultimately, representation and signification show us how we create meaning, yet they are also expanded to identity, as our feelings of who we become are influenced by how we identify with certain things like images and symbols within our culture. The next argument we focus on is that cultural studies scholars believe that audiences are active participants in the interpretation of a message, and therefore different meanings can be drawn from the same text due to one's cultural context and past life experiences. They argue that the audience is not controlled by the text, but rather the audience makes their own meaning and interpretation of the text. As active audience receivers, the receiver can decode messages in a number of ways, regardless of the way the sender has encoded the message. This active position in the decoding of a message is due to the different cultures and backgrounds the audience members have. Members of an audience will respond to text differently based on their position and identity in their cultural context. This allows for multiple meanings to be made out of the same idea, text, or object. We can go back to the same example of Jessica Lynch used in the previous argument. I mentioned that individuals viewed her as a symbol of courage and bravery. Well, this was true for some. There were also people who saw Lynch as a symbol of what was wrong with the Bush administration's rationale during this time. So this reveals that each individual interpreted the meaning of Lynch differently depending on their cultural feelings towards war. The last argument of focus includes that employing a critical methodology that uses a combined approach of the studies of rhetoric and culture may result in a more accurate and effective analysis. And these studies have differences, yet when used together, one can better understand the true contextual meaning of a text. So the studies of rhetoric and the studies of culture have specific focuses. Some of these differences include the fact that rhetorical studies focus on texts, and rhetorical studies takes a neutral position towards an artifact, and they focus on legitimate social institutions. As for cultural studies, this study takes a focus on context, and it has a political position towards the issue at hand, and it emphasizes alternative institutions that resist establishment. So despite these differences, these areas of study merge and overlap in many ways. And rhetoric's relationship to cultural studies is difficult to ignore. The argument being made here is that when these factors are combined and looked at as a whole, a very detailed, impactful analysis can be conducted. To support this, Borchers and Hundley provide readers with a case study of two individuals named Blair and Mitchell, who examined the astronauts' memorial at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Center in Florida. So when taking a rhetorical perspective by just focusing on the memorial itself, the individuals concluded that the memorial was impactful and appropriate to the situation, and they believed it to be interesting and rich for its viewers. Just when they thought of the memorial as a success, they noticed that the audience of the memorial did not have reactions that aligned with their analysis. So the audience didn't seem to recognize the significance of the memorial, and they just kind of carried on with their conversations after looking at it for a brief moment. And along with this, they also recognized, or the two individuals conducting the study recognized that each individual in the audience wore some type of Disney attire. So by taking a cultural perspective and analyzing the context in which the individuals were viewing the memorial, they realized that the viewer saw the memorial as just another theme park attraction, as they were most likely stopping at the Space Center as they were either on their way to Disney or coming back from Disney. So by taking a combined approach, Blair and Mitchell acknowledged that although the memorial is appropriate and meaningful, it fails to be effective to the crowd that typically comes in and out of the Space Museum. So they concluded that analyzing text with only a rhetorical perspective is not wrong, but it's just one way to analyze something. So by combining different approaches, a more full and accurate conclusion can be drawn.
I'm going to be talking about the importance of and the connections of this chapter. Overall, the ideas expressed throughout this chapter can be applied to each of our lives. As individuals who can't be helped but be influenced by various messages and dominant ideologies that permeate the media. Through this chapter, we learn to be more active audience members by rhetorically and culturally examining television shows, advertisements, music, text, and other forms of communications we come across through our lives. Examining forms of media in a less passive way will allow us to no longer be subject to dominant ideologies that pervade our society. Also, employing cultural studies allows us to learn more about our own selves. As the meaning we draw from text, we can relate to the social structure and history of our own cultures and backgrounds. In conclusion, applying these components of culture cultural studies, along with components of critical theory, allows writers and rhetoricians to have more control over the navigations of their everyday lives. As for the connections to this course, Chapter 11 enables writers and rhetoricians to understand the idea that a message's meaning is strongly dependent upon cultural factors, recognizing that meaning is produced from within one's cultural context is important, as this allows writers and rhetoricians to understand why someone might not interpret a message the same way that they did. We can learn to more effectively communicate to certain groups of people by acknowledging that an individual may interpret a message differently due to their cultural context. Furthermore, there are also certain aspects of this chapter that closely relate to the content that we have studied throughout this course. For instance, in Chapter 5, we studied personalization and conversational tones and learned that these techniques can be used to further persuade audiences. In Chapter 11, we learn how commercials and various media sources attempt to use their persuasive strategies in order to encourage their audience to believe the ideologies it portrays. By being aware of these techniques, we are able to combat their influences on us. Another key term we focus on in Chapter 5 was symbolic signs. From this, we learned that culture assigns meaning to certain symbols. This idea is elaborated on in Chapter 11, as we learn exactly why one culture may have a different meaning than another culture from the same sign. In addition to Chapter 5, Chapter 6 also closely relates to the course content of Chapter 11. In Chapter 6, we are first introduced to the idea that context controls how we ascribe meaning to symbols. We learn that Ogen and Richards believed context was one of the main reasons individuals interpreted things differently from another one. In Chapter 11, Brochures and Hundley continue the discussion of this idea and explain how one's cultural assumptions determine how they interpret or make meaning out of objects, ideas, or individuals. Connections from outside course. Along with these connections to the content of this class itself, this chapter also reveals some direct links to SMAD courses. Many SMAD courses teach the idea that the media skews our thoughts on certain stories, people, or groups of people, resulting in stereotypes and false beliefs. In my SMAD 150 course, we learned that the new perceptions that the idea of violence, crime had significantly risen over the years. What is interesting is that the level of violence and crime had actually decreased over the years, yet individuals persuaded to act on the false ideas that they are exposed on in the media. Through Chapter 11, we are provided with ways to combat and influence the ideologies portrayed by the media. Brochures and Hundley express how we can function as active audiences who take a negotiated or oppositional subject position to the various ideas we are presented with. A negotiated subject position is where the audience doesn't accept the ideology the text is trying to portray, but doesn't reject it either. They decode it in a way that suits their interests. An oppositional subject position is one who resists the text ideology's message. When watching the news, we can learn to not just passively participate, but rather think about what is true or what is false. Think of how we identify with what is being portrayed, and also think about the motives behind what is being presented in the news.
So one scholarly source that we found was from the Journal of Current Perspectives in Social Theory, and the article was called Epistemology, Culture and Rhetoric, Some Social Implications of Human Cognition. And in the article, Burns and Lemoine, the authors, outline how cognitive processes merge with social processes. They focus on how culture is created through the use of symbols on an individual level. For example, in the reading they say, we consider theoretical and empirical work in cognitive psychology in the ways individuals process information in a social context, and then progress to more macro level cultural phenomena. Therefore, they claim that culture and social phenomena affect how people process information. Additionally, they explore how limits on information processing affects cultural hegemony. For example, in the reading, the authors claim that quote, cultural similarities can be seen as similarities in ways of prioritizing information. This means that people can only process so much information at a time, so they have to pick and choose what information they process using their cultural background. So in our chapter, the authors discuss how audiences are active participants in the interpretation of a message, and therefore different meanings can be drawn from the same text due to one's cultural context and past life experiences. Similarly, the article by Burns and Lemoine is focused on how someone's cultural background can affect how they perceive messages. They discuss how symbols and rhetoric on an individual level is impacted by cultural and social contexts. Specifically, they say in the article that, quote, legitimacy of an argument is likely to be judged against the backdrop of semantic networks, but these networks arise in and are modified in a social context.
We hope that you have learned about the connection between critical theory and cultural studies throughout this presentation, and we encourage you to analyze text not in just one way, but in many ways in order to strengthen your skills as a writer and rhetorician.
We have also included a discussion prompt for you guys to think about. So think about a TV show that you have watched before and try to decide what type of subject position you typically take while watching the show and why. Do you watch it just because you enjoy it? Do you watch it because it's a popular show? Like, what are your reasonings and how do you think this reasoning affects the way you view the show? Thank you for watching, and we hope you learned something.